hands in the fields of Lumala, with
African
women who owned
soldiers
nothing
couldn't
but gave
lead.
everything.
They said
And
our
so
people were too
the
poor,
question
too
that
broken,
echoed across the
too
continent
divided to
was
rise.
Niles.
But
They
on the night
timed
of the
pauses.
30th of
They mapped
September
applause. I don't call it a debate.
2022,
Trump
that lie
chuckled
died
to his
in the
inner
streets
circle.
of
Call it a
Ouagadougou
demonstration.
before the sun
I'm
could
going to
rise.
show this kid how power
The
walks.
sound of boots
No
echoed
research.
across the
No
capital.
read.
A
Engineers coded,
4-year-old
designed,
captain
and
unknown to
built
the world
drones
took
from
down a
scratch.
government,
No import,
expelled the French,
no permissions,
and declared
no
to the
oversight
West,
from
this
Washington,
land
Brussels,
is not for sale.
or Paris.
This gold
Because
is not
real
yours,
sovereignty isn't
and
gifted.
this is
Spoke
Africa.
first.
And we
We've
are
traced
done
over
kneeling.
$340 million
His name,
in
Ibrahim
illicit transactions
Traoré,
tied to
his
Trump
weapon,
enterprises through
courage,
Luxembourg,
his
the
mission
Caymans,
to finish
even a
what
fake
Sankara
cocoa import
started
firm in
and
Benin. Ibrahim
give
nodded.
Burkina Faso back
We
to
have
its people.
rest. Stay
They
with
tried
us.
to silence
Because
him,
this isn't just a story
they call him
about a
dangerous.
village or a
But the
factory.
elders saw
It's about
Sankara
what
in his
happens when
fire.
black
And
hands
the youth,
stop
they
asking for
called him
permission and
hope.
start building what
Can a
Captain
man
Traoré
lead a
understands,
country
and why
out
global
of
powers are
chains
growing nervous.
without asking
Because if
permission
one
from
country
the
can
empire?
feed itself
Can
with its own people,
Burkina
if
Faso
one president can
become the
trust his
spark
farmers more than his
that lights
donors,
a continent?
then others will
Stay with
follow.
us.
What's
Because this isn't
listened,
just
but
another
something
story.
has
It's
shifted.
the future
On May
our
22nd,
ancestors
2025,
dreamed of.
a factory opened in a
Subscribe
small,
and
dusty village
join
named
us
Penny, not
for
passed
an
along,
Africa that no
not through
longer
encrypted
bows
emails,
its head.
but through
On
human
the night
trust,
of the
one
30th
voice to
of
another,
September,
village to
et
village,
anciennes Raja,
across miles
Burkina
of Swiss.
Faso
They only
was
took
not
what served
asleep.
them.
It was
kernel,
holding its breath
The commodity,
of the streets
the cash
of
crop,
Ouagadougou,
the rest
of the capital,
left to rot.
lay silent,
And so,
not from
year after
peace,
year,
but from
but
tension.
the apple,
The kind
that
of
part died
silence
at home,
that comes
underfoot,
when the people have
unloved.
suffered for too
They
long,
told us
when
Africans could
promises
harvest,
rot,
but
when
never transform.
foreign
They
boots
told us we
dig
were
deep into your
supposed,
soil,
but
and
knew
when
how
the
to
young have
rotate
seen too many
crops
dreams
and
buried
double a
beneath the
harvest.
flag of foreign
Women
aid,
who had no
but that
titles,
night, a
no
different
microphones,
sound broke
but held the
through.
power to
It wasn't
feed
chanting
entire
or
provinces.
protest. It was
So
strategy.
he made a promise,
It was
not just in
precision.
words.
And
We
it
give the
came from a
world
group
a show.
of young,
Ibrahim said nothing.
disciplined
Let's
soldiers
host a debate.
led by a man
Trump
barely
continued.
in his mid-30s,
You and me,
a Captain
live.
Ibrahim
Someone else
Traoré,
processed.
qui est
Someone
serious,
else profited.
unshaken,
No one ever
had
told the
spent
farmer that
months
the fruit
watching
had
his country
more
fall
vitamin
apart
C than an
under
orange.
the weight of
No
corruption
one ever
and
told the
foreign
local co-op
interference.
that the
He
fruit
wasn't
mark
born into
6th,
politics.
2025,
He wasn't raised for
Lumila,
power. He
Burkina
was
Faso.
forged
There were no
in
red
fire
carpets that
in the
morning.
deserts
No
of Mali.
motorcade
in the
announcement.
frontline
Just the
battles,
faint sound of
with
an
jihadist
engine stopping by the
insurgents,
edge of a
in
field.
the betrayal
aid
of
has never
commanders who
grown what
left
they grow.
soldiers to die
It has never
without
pulled
weapons
onions
or
from the
wages.
dirt at dawn.
He had
It has
seen
never
how
stood beneath the
soldiers
sun.
bled
Sweat
for
running
a country
down.
run by
It was
men
there,
in suits
all
who
along,
answered to
like a story
France,
buried
not
beneath
to the
dust,
people.
waiting for
Who
someone to
Traoré
read it aloud
gathered
again.
his most
The cashew
loyal
apple is not
soldiers,
just a fruit.
men who were
It's a
not
symbol
politicians,
of potential
but patriots, men who
Florida
believed that
air.
a coup
But
wasn't
across the
betrayal,
ocean, something else was
self-defense.
stirring.
On
No
that
stage,
September night,
no
while the
scripts,
government slept,
just a man in uniform,
Traoré's forces
buried in truth.
executed
Beneath the
their plan with
presidential
military
palace,
precision.
What
radio
comes
stations
next?
Were
When
taken,
victory demands not only
buildings
celebration,
occupied,
but responsibility. So,
blocked.
stay
The
with us.
interim
It is a
president,
statement,
Lieutenant
because here's the truth.
Colonel
Africa
Paul Henry,
has always
Damiba,
produced,
who
we've
himself
grown,
had come to power
we've
in a
dug,
coup earlier
we've
that year,
carried,
was swiftly
that
removed
worked harder
before
than
dawn
it earned.
of the people of
Burkina
Burkina
Faso,
Faso woke
Penny
up to
was
a new
just another
sound,
rural
the voice
village
of
known
Captain
for its
Traoré on
cashew
national
harvest,
radio. He
forgotten
spoke
for everything
clearly,
else.
directly.
Every season
There were no grand
because this
promises.
isn't
only
just
one
another
truth.
story of
We
war.
took
It's the
this step
blueprint of a
because our
future
nation was
that
dying.
no longer waits
No
to be saved.
More foreign
Subscribe.
control.
Africa,
No more stolen
business meets
gold.
revolution.
No
But
more
this
lies.
wasn't business,
The streets
and it
erupted,
wasn't a debate.
not in
This
chaos,
was a mirror,
but in
and
celebration.
only one
Hundreds
non-recognized
gather with
of
flags,
wealth discarded,
and
of
songs.
black brilliance
They
left
didn't
to
know
rot
everything
under the
about
sun,
this young captain,
because no
but
one
they knew
gave it a
one thing.
barcode.
He
But here's
wasn't
the thing.
afraid.
The
Across
world is
Africa,
changing. Chapter
the news
begins in Penny.
Spread
And before we tell
like
you what's being built
wildfire.
there,
A
let
new
us remember
leader
what was
had
almost
emerged,
lost.
not
A
chosen
fraud,
by ballots,
a future,
but by
a sense of
bravery,
worth.
not
Burkina
supported
Faso
by the
nations,
West, but
no
by
foreign
the
advisors,
people. The
just,
French
precision,
embassy,
silence,
surrounded by
and a
angry
nation that
youth,
decided to
waving
fight its war in
signs
its
that
own
read,
language. What
Africa
builders,
is not your
healers,
colony.
mothers
The French
of a new
troops
Africa.
stationed
Captain
in Burkina
Ibrahim
Faso
Traoré
since
knows this.
2013.
That's why he
ordered
calls
out
them his
French
Amazons,
media.
not
Then,
as praise,
The
but as
message was
truth.
clear.
When he walked
The
into the
era
zone
of
of
quiet
fingerprints
occupation was
of
over.
Western economic
And,
sabotage,
Yet,
some
while the
signed,
people
some
cheered,
sealed,
the West
some already
panicked.
dead.
Paris
Major Umarun's
called
gone
it
for a
dangerous.
contract. He
Washington
didn't speak for a
labeled
while.
it
When he did,
destabilizing.
the words fell like stone.
Mainstream media
He thinks
painted
this will be a
Traoré
debate.
as a reckless
Pausash
rebel,
could be
a
turned into
threat to
wine,
democracy,
or vinegar,
but
or juice.
in the
No one
villages
invested in that
of
kind of machinery.
Burkina
No
Faso,
one trained the
in the fields
youth in
where
that kind of science.
gold had been
Because
dug,
no one thought Africa
for
needed to be a
strangers.
thing or two.
in
But the
the
moment the call
homes
ended,
where
Ibrahim
mothers
turned to
prayed for
Umaru,
bread,
bring them in.
Captain
He said,
Traoré was not
within
a
the
threat.
hour, 5
was an
people were
answer.
seated inside
Was
a
it legal?
not
No.
to satellites
Was it
or
just
foreign
the
analysts,
people thought?
but to the soil, to the
So,
wind, to the people who
because
live
when
where
your
maps fade.
democracy has been
Long
stolen
before the
by
first
foreign
draft,
interests,
He was about
sometimes
to
a
teach a
soldier
lesson.
with dust on
Let's
his boots
host a
looks
global
more
debate.
trustworthy
He
than
said,
a man in a tie.
Show the world
The
how
night
leadership
of the
works.
30th
He
of
thought
September
Africa a
was
backbend
not
from
just
labor
a coup,
that has
it
never
was
stayed
a
after the
declaration
funding ends.
that Burkina
Aid doesn't know
Faso,
the names of the women in
the
Nomila,
land of
but the
upright people,
land
was
does,
standing again,
and that is enough.
and this time
For
it would not
decades,
bow.
Africa has been dressed
before we talk
independency
about gold,
programs
let's
just
talk
because
about
that
the
was
theft.
what the world demanded.
For over
The
a
nut
century,
Was money.
Burkina Faso
The nut
was not
had
Burkina
value.
Faso.
The nut filled
It was
sacks and
called
trucks and
Upper
shipping
Volta,
containers
a
bound for
name
Europe,
stamped on
India,
it by the
Vietnam.
French,
It's
not
earned.
by its people.
And for the people
the
of
land,
Burkina Faso,
the language,
it meant no
and
longer
the lives
waiting
of
for
millions
aid
were
that
claimed
never
and carved
arrives.
up like a map
It meant no
passed
longer
across
asking for
colonial dining
listening
tables.
to those who
The
had
French
been ignored.
didn't come to
He
offer
traveled to
progress,
the north.
and
He
they came
spoke
for
not in press
profit
releases,
in
but in courtyard circles.
1896.
And when the
France
elders told pure chamber beneath the
control of the
presidential
region.
palace,
They didn't
no
bring freedom.
windows,
They brought
no
chains.
phones,
What did they
only
want?
steel,
Gold,
memory,
cotton,
and trust.
labor. And they
No
took it by
hotels,
force.
no
By
highways,
1932,
no headlines,
they had dissolved
just
Upper Volta
fields,
altogether,
dust,
slicing
and farmers
it into
whose hands
pieces
told the story
and
of a
giving the
land
land
drones
to
in the night
neighboring
sky.
colonies. It
And
wasn't a
then
country anymore.
Fire
It was a resource.
in a
A
single
gold mine with no
ruthless
name.
operation.
Its people
Over
were
1,000
workers
insurgents were wiped
with no
out in
wages,
northern Burkina
of
Faso.
farmers
There were no
with
warnings,
no
non-negotiate
harvest,
and turn away.
citizens
He did not look for
with
vengeance.
no nation,
He
and yet
looked
they
for meaning,
endured
because
by
to him, the silence that
1960
followed was
under
louder than the
pressure
bombs.
from
At
anti-colonial
exactly 4
uprisings
in the morning,
and global
the sky above
outrage,
Tehran did not
France
welcome the dawn.
granted
There was no bird
independence.
song,
But
no sun,
independence,
only fire,
in name
only the long,
is
cold
still
scream
captivity.
of sirens cutting
They
through the quiet of a
introduced
sleeping
the
nation.
CFA
The tons
franc,
of food a
a
year,
currency
all cultivated by
controlled
women.
by Paris.
Most of them
They
over
signed
50.
economic
Many of
agreements
them widowed.
that ensured
all of them
Burkina's gold
warriors.
flowed out
But across
while poverty
Burkina
stayed
Faso,
in.
the news traveled
They
fast,
kept
not through press
military
conferences
bases.
or social
They
media
kept
blasts,
influence.
but by
They
whispers
kept control.
from elder me
The
back.
people were
Then
told,
there's Mariam,
"You're free," but
63,
their pockets said
widowed
otherwise.
by the war.
And
She
here's
could
the
have given
truth
up.
that
Many
Western
did,
media
but she
won't
gathered
say
the young women,
over
taught
$78
them how
billion
to till,
of
how
gold
to
has
plant,
left Burkina
how
Faso
to
soil
stand to
and
get
gone
layers
straight
of raw
into
material.
Western vaults.
Nothing more.
Gold
So we
that
believe
could have
them,
built schools,
not out of
staffed
ignorance,
hospitals,
but because
paved
that's
roads.
how the global
Instead,
economy was
it
built.
paved the way
African
for foreign
picked.
luxury.
This was
Not
International
African dignity.
Women's Rights
When
Day.
President
a day
Thomas Sankara
The world often
came to
marks with
power in
hashtags and
1983,
headlines,
he
but
tried
in
to
Lumina,
change that.
there was only
And
when the time
he
came.
renamed the
They didn't
nation to
hesitate.
Burkina Faso,
This was a war,
the land of upright
not of
people.
domination,
Have you
but of
rejected
reclamation.
Western aid?
And the night the
Empowered
sky
women
burned over
in
Arbinda,
distributed land,
the world saw the
and
result of
wore
a
the
nation
same
no
clothes
longer
as
waiting
the
for permission to
farmers.
defend its
He
snare with
believed
a tan and
Africa
a
could
tie
stand without
on the
begging.
other.
But
A captain in
in
uniform,
1987,
born from struggle,
Sankara
raised
was
by
assassinated.
resistance.
Bullets
Captain
replaced
Ibrahim
ballots.
Traoré,
And
Donald Trump,
many believe France
smiling
had
that day.
a hand in that
he
death.
believed fresh
His
crimson
closest
tie.
friend
His
Blaise
advisors
Compaoré
wrote
took power
one-liners
and
like
held it
bullets
for
short,
27
sharp,
years.
and meant
Under
to
him,
pierce.
The
They
old deals
practiced
returned
smahunga, false
mines
promises. But
reopened
not
to
once has she
foreigners.
buried her will.
The gold flowed
Each morning
again,
before sunrise,
just
she's
not
in the fields,
into the hands of
barefoot,
Burkinabe families.
headscarf,
By the time Ibrahim
tight,
Traoré was born in
fingers in the earth.
1988,
This soil,
the country
all
had gone
silence,
quiet
peace,
again.
and
Not
preemption
from
justice.
peace, but from
And for every
exhaustion.
elder who remembers
People
the
had
sound of
forgotten what
chains,
dignity
for
tasted
every
like.
grandmother who taught freedom
But
must be
Traoré
defended in whispers.
Hadn't
First,
forgotten Sankara.
this question
He read
echoes
speeches.
still.
He walked the streets
It
where
will be a
Sankara
mirror.
once stood.
And so the plan began.
He dreamed
Not a
of
press strategy,
finishing what
not
was
a
left
counter-narrative,
undone.
a revelation,
So when
a
Traoré rose
stripping
to
of
power,
pretense,
one of
a
his
ceremony
first
of
moves
truth
was
televised.
to take back
This wasn't
the
just
mines.
Captain Ibrahim,
It,
boots dusty,
He didn't
walking
just
between
call
rows
for
of green
change,
beans and
he
eggplants,
legislated it.
like he belonged
He
to the soil.
nationalized
No
5
speeches,
of the biggest
no
gold
press,
mines in the country.
just presence,
And he
15th
demanded
principle,
that
a crack
foreign
in the
companies
rules
give at
that
least
hold the
15%
world together.
equity to the government
What if war
and
no
train
longer
local
needs
workers.
justification?
He ordered
What
the
if?
construction
The new law
of a
is
gold
fear,
refinery,
measured not in
the
courts,
first
but
in
in
Burkina's
payloads,
history.
who
So the
seeds,
country
no
could finally
development,
process
grant,
its own resources.
train them.
It
They
wasn't
relied
just a
on
policy,
one another,
it
on
was
memory,
reparations in motion.
on muscle,
And
on the
yes,
rhythm of rain,
the West
cold, hard
screamed,
numbers.
they
That should have
called
sparked
him
outrage.
dangerous,
In
a radical,
2024, Burkina
uncooperative,
Faso
but the
harvested
people
nearly
called him something else,
400,000 tons
a
of
son
cashew
of the
apple.
soil.
They
Because for the
didn't ask a
first time
single
in
question
decades,
about
the
Burkina
wealth
Faso.
of Burkina
Why would
Faso
he,
was returning
him,
to its roots.
Africa was an
No longer
audience,
would
not a
gold
threat.
be dug by
Pulse.
black hands to
Nearly
decorate
all of
white
it
necks.
wasted. The
And,
country had the
no
capacity
longer
to
would the
process
soil cry out
30,000 tons
while
of raw
its
nuts.
children starved.
But
No longer
barely
would the
half.
nation,
that was
rich in
processed
resources,
domestically.
remain poor in
Our
hope.
names forgotten.
This was
So
not
when Burkina
about
Faso decided
revenge.
to bottle its
It was
cashew
about
apples,
restoration.
instead of
A
discarding them,
78
it wasn't just an
billion,
economic act.
investment had been
It was
made,
a spiritual one.
not in banks,
It was dictated to by those who
dream
never lived its
that
pain.
Africa could
When
own
Traoré
its
came
past,
to power,
shape
he
its
didn't
present,
beg for foreign
and command its
intervention.
future.
He dismantled
and
it.
Burkina Faso
He sent
was
Western
just
military
getting started.
bases packing.
He was just
He
19,
refused aid
no land,
that came with
no job,
2 screens,
no passport.
89 countries,
He had
one
one
man
thing,
about to be
a seed.
unmasked,
His
and
name
one nation
was
ready to rise.
Mamadou.
This is not.
Like many others
Sometimes
in
He
Burkina
wears
Faso,
a head wrap
and he'd
and
grown up,
walks barefoot through a
watching
field.
his parents
They
struggle
told
through
us aid
seasons
would
of
save
drought
us.
and death.
They told us
He
that food
saw
arrived anything more
foreign
than a plantation
corporations
for someone
take
else's
the
wealth.
best plots of
And so it became
farmland,
routine. Crack the
leaving
nut,
only dry
toss
soil
the fruit,
for
don't
the rest.
ask questions.
He saw
But in the
food
quiet of those
imported
rural
from
mornings,
Europe,
the world came for our
tomatoes
nuts
from Italy,
and left the fruit
onions
to die.
from
But
France,
now, from the red
sold
soil
at
of
prices
penny,
his family
we are
couldn't
turning
afford.
what was wasted
But
into
Mamadou
gold.
believed
They
in
never
something
wanted the
dangerous
whole hard concrete room
that
where even
Burkina
echoes
Faso could
dare
feel
not
itself.
linger.
It
Captain
wasn't
Ibrahim
alone.
sat in silence.
Across the country,
No advisors,
thousands of
no
young people
rehearsals,
were beginning
just
to walk
function
away from cities,
from the soil up.
from slums,
And that's why
from
this story matters.
unemployment, and
Not
toward
because it's
the
about fruit,
land,
but because
it
it's about reclaiming
wasn't
value,
a return
about
to poverty.
rewriting.
It was
Who
a
gets to
revolt
say what
against
cultural
dependency.
ecosystem?
Captain
The numbers tell a
Ibrahim
story of their
Traoré
own.
didn't start this revolution, but he
68,960
lit a
tons of
fire under
fertilizers,
it within
18,000
weeks of
tons
taking
of
power.
high-yield seeds.
Traoré launched
Something else was
a
rotten.
national
Not just the
initiative
cashew apple,
to
but
restore
dignity.
food sovereignty.
Generation after
The goal
generation
was
of
clear.
farmers were trained
Make
to discard
Burkina
what was
Faso
theirs, to let the best part
self-sufficient,
fall.
no
Ferment.
more
Listen closely.
begging,
This is
no
the
more
story they
handouts,
hoped you'd never hear.
no more hunger in a
And the
land that had
beginning
once been known as
is
the
only just
breadbasket
beginning.
of West
Cuộc
Africa.
gọi không phải là
Is
mở
he
đầu cho một
opened
cuộc
land
trò chuyện.
registries to
Nó là
youth
khởi đầu của một
cooperatives.
kết thúc.
He
They say,
offered free
real
seed,
history never lies of a new
subsidized
kind of
tools,
warfare.
and
Born not in Western
access to
boardrooms,
water retention
but in
systems.
dusty village
He gave young
compounds and
people a
underground
message
workshops
of the
where
future of
young
this
African
nation
files
is
and
not in
memory.
Paris.
He read
It's
names like
in
prayers.
the soil
He
beneath
studied
your
bank
feet,
codes like
and
battle
the
maps.
young listened
He didn't
fields
prepare
that
when.
had been
He
abandoned for
prepared to
decades
reveal
began to
every
bloom
number,
again.
every
Maize,
timestamp,
millet,
every forged,
groundnuts,
the same
not
cycle,
for export,
repeated,
not for
pick
profit,
the nut,
but for the
sell it
people
off,
in
toss
the
the fruit
east,
aside,
near Capturé.
sweet.
Groups
Golden
of
red cashew
20-somethings
apples
built small
covered the
greenhouses
ground
from
like
scrap
confetti. They
and
don't need
old
applause.
tarpaulin.
They need markets.
In the north,
They need
near
roads. They need time. And they're
a
getting
young
it.
woman
For the first
named
time in
Fatimata
decades,
cultivated
not talking about them.
drought-resistant
It's
beans
listening to them.
and trained
And if you've
other
ever been
girls to do
fed,
the same.
she says,
In the south,
without looking up,
they call
remembers who we
themselves
are.
les
These are not
gardiens
women
du
waiting
sol,
for help.
the
These are
guardians of
not
the soil.
statistics.
For
These are
generations,
architects,
African
whores,
youth
and trendy blogs
told,
bottled in Brazil,
farming
branded
is
in
backward,
Mumbai and
farming
Africa,
is
still shipping
shameful.
nuts,
If you are
still
smart,
dumping the apple.
you leave the land.
That's when the question
now,
became too loud to go
something
open
was
another
shifting.
folder. We believe
Farming
Trump
was
greenlit
becoming
a covert
revolutionary,
op in
and it wasn't just
2021
about
to destabilize
food, it was
a
about
West
freedom,
African administration.
because when you don't
Motive.
grow your own food,
Man had the
you
courage
borrow,
to hold it up.
and when you
The
borrow,
public didn't know
you
that
bend,
Trump had walked into a
and
courtroom,
when
that
you bend too
I
long,
accept, but only on one
you
condition.
forget
No
how to
script.
stand.
No
Ibrahim
filters.
Traoré's
No
government
questions in
understood
advance.
this.
We
They
speak,
invested
and the world
heavily in
listens.
local seed
Trump
banks,
laughed.
traditional
Perfect. You'll learn
irrigation,
even years
and
in the making.
agroecological
And at the center
research,
of it all was
turning
Captain
all
Ibrahim
indigenous
Traoré,
techniques into
the
national
man
policy.
who made a promise.
For the first time,
Burkina Faso
the Ministry of
will no longer be
Agriculture
scorched
wasn't
earth.
run by
Captain
foreign
Traoré
consultants in
didn't
air-conditioned
create
rooms.
this system.
He
but
was
he understood
led
it.
by farmers,
And more importantly,
real farmers.
he respected it.
And yet,
When he
the
took
West
leadership,
called
he
this
didn't start
backwards.
with drones
They said,
or divisions.
African countries
started by
must
business,
industrialize,
Trade,
must
things your
globalize,
continent still
but what
needs to
they
learn.
feared
Think of it
was
as
not
educational.
Burkina Faso's
There was a
failure.
pause.
What
Then
they
Ibrahim
feared
responded feeds others,
was its success.
not ourselves.
Because
That the
if
fruit of our
Burkina
hands
Faso could
literally
grow its
doesn't
own
belong
food,
to us.
build
This wasn't just
its
about
own
agriculture.
tools,
It was about
and
identity.
feed its own
And then
people
came the studies,
who would
things
need
into a chain of
imported wheat,
trust.
who
And that
would
trust
need,
flowed
foreign
back
aid.
into the heart of
It
the
wasn't
nation.
just about
But
vegetables.
this wasn't about
It was
high-tech
about vision
surveillance from
in,
space.
speech,
It was human,
broadcast
grounded,
from
rooted,
a village coup.
and it worked.
Traoré
While Traoré
said,
Kring and
our
Sachs stamped with
ancestors
foreign flags
survived
generosity,
without supermarkets.
that loans with interest
They lived
were
with
support, that
dignity.
consultants with
Now it's
clipboards
our
were
turn.
allies.
This
But
was
the women
young
of Burkina
farmers'
Faso
revolution.
know better.
And it was
The
not
soldiers and
televised,
local volunteers
but it was
advanced
real.
from the
Mamadou.
shadows. They
Now,
didn't scream.
Tens,
They didn't
4
taunt.
hectares with
They
3
executed
friends.
For 6
They don't wear
hours.
suits.
The
They wear callous
landlocked
hands.
country,
They
poor,
don't make
dependent,
headlines.
fragile.
They make harvests.
But today,
And
under the
if you
leadership
ever
of Captain
visit their
Ibrahim
field,
Traoré,
there's a
it
small
is rewriting
wooden
the rules
sign
of resistance.
planted at
This
the
wasn't
entrance.
just a military
It
strike.
reads,
It
"We
was the
don't farm for
rest
profit.
was exported
We
raw,
farm for
unfinished,
power." She stands at
underpriced.
the edge of
We
a
weren't
cracked
just
field,
losing money.
barefoot,
We were losing
back
meaning.
bent,
And
baby
yet,
on her back.
something
With
about
one
the
hand,
cashew
she
apple,
holds a
and
hoe
where black
with the
sovereignty
other.
began with black
She
soil.
shields a
Captain
child from
Traoré
the sun.
didn't speak of food
This
security
is
in
not just a
abstract
woman.
terms.
This is a
He spoke of
continent
women,
standing
land,
upright. Her
of
name
the
is
truth that no
Aminata,
nation is free
and like
if it
millions
kept a
of
luxury.
women across Burkina
The
Faso,
people began to
she does
fight
not
back
own the land.
in the
She
only way
works,
they could,
she
by
does
watching,
not earn
by
the wealth
remembering,
she generates.
by whispering.
But without
A
her,
shepherd noticed
nothing
tire
grows.
tracks
When
that
the war
weren't there
came,
yesterday.
it did not
A mother
knock.
heard a food
It tore
programs will buy
through
from these
the
women, not
villages
foreign
in the
importers.
north, ripping
Because
through homes,
real sovereignty doesn't come
silencing
from
markets,
speeches. It comes from
sending
seeds. Across
husbands and
Africa.
sons into
Aid
hiding or to the
agencies
front
speak
lines.
of development.
But Aminata
But
stayed
development would
because
listen.
someone had to
He
feed the
thought
children.
Ibrahim would kneel.
They say
But this
war
wasn't a
is
debate.
a man's domain,
This was a reckoning.
but it is the
Centuries
women
overdue.
who bury the bodies,
Because what Trump
who
didn't know
boil
in Back
what
Date
little
Project,
remains,
not a photo
who
op, a
teach
real
the
industrial
orphan
facility
to remember
worth
their names.
$1.5 million
Under Ibrahim
built for
Traoré,
one
Rule,
purpose. To
rural
process the fruit,
women
every
like
230,000 tons
became
of fodder
visible
for
again.
livestock,
They were no longer seen
10,000
as shadows
tons of
behind
fish
soldiers
feed
or
to boost
dependents
aquaculture
on the edge
someone
of
else
survival.
had thrown away.
They were
No
pillars
outsiders.
of the Republic.
Let it.
He introduced
Western
land
partners
grants to
branded
single
it.
mothers
This was
and
Burkina
widows.
Faso's own decision.
Built women's
built from the ground
agricultural
up, and
cooperatives
missiles
run by
struck without
women,
warning.
owned by
Research
women.
centers
He
reduced
sent
to rubble.
mobile clinics
Labs turned to
to
ash.
remote
The
villages.
operation had a name,
So pregnant women
Rising Lion.
wouldn't have to walk
And just
30
like
miles
that,
to give
the
birth.
world was reminded
And when
that in
asked
there,
by
she
Western
speaks
journalists
softly,
why,
like
Traoré
someone who's
answered
seen storms
simply,
and waited them out.
if you want to
We
build
don't just
a
grow
nation,
food.
you
She
start
tells
with
me
the women.
we grow dignity sweat.
The challenges
sun
were
and
immense.
silence.
Aminata,
Until that silence
like
was
many
broken
others.
by the sight of their
Farms in
president
the
walking
region,
into the field
still
like a
stalked by
brother
militants.
returning home.
The
The
child
land
on her
covered
back is not just
3
her own, she also
hectares.
raises
It
her
yielded
sister's children.
85. What burned in
orphaned
that sky was
after
not the promise
a
of a
bomb
new
blast.
day. It
She
was something
knows
else,
the
a
sound of
message
gunfire
written in smoke,
better than a
sent
lullaby.
with
Yet
warplanes.
every morning,
Quiet May morning
sings
in
anyway. To
2025.
her,
Birds
soil
stirring
is
over
sacred. She
Ouagadougou.
waters it
Coffee brewing
with
in the
sweat,
palace corridor.
not complaint.
One side
She plants
rehearsed
with
applause.
trembling hands,
The other rehearsed truth.
but
4
an
days.
unbreakable heart.
That's all the world had to brace
Sometimes
itself.
She
4
tells her
days
children,
before cooperative
this is the
bent
same
low
earth
over
that
the
Thomas
land,
Sankara
pulling
walked,
onions from the
and
rich
they ask
earth.
her,
They
will
did not
Captain
expect a
Traoré
visitor,
visit
much
our
less
village
the
too?
president of their
Her
country.
answer is
And yet,
always,
There he
and he
was,
already has.
sleeves
Every
rolled,
time you plant
knew
a
what
seed,
didn't belong,
these women
a stranger's
forgotten
accent,
in reports,
a motorbike
ignored by
that hadn't
history,
been seen before,
are now
a
the
face with no
faces
family
of
ties.
a
They
different
whispered these
kind
and
of
who must
resistance,
never strike at all.
not
And
with
yet,
guns,
Ibrahim understood
but
exactly
with
what had
grains,
happened.
not
Because
with
war
speeches,
is not just a clash
but
of armies.
with supper.
It is
During a
assistance,
drought
trapped in a
last year,
diplomatic
it
storm
was
over land
Aminata's
rights.
coup
Yet here,
that shared
in a
water
modest field,
with nearby
a new
settlements.
model was being
Not because
planted.
the government told them
Wandia
to,
slept.
but
Ibrahim
because
and his
they
inner circle were
remembered
digging.
what it means
Bank
to
records,
be a community.
blood
Because
contracts,
in Burkina Faso,
satellite
the word
footage.
for mother
The
and
trail led to
nurturer
one name,
come from
not
the
for
same
pity,
root,
but for
and,
relief. For
it's not
decades,
just
they had
aid
heard only
they offer.
silence from those
These
who governed
women
them. Now,
now
they heard
export
recognition
dried
and
okra,
powers to care about
shea
lives that
butter,
never made their
and
headlines.
medicinal herbs
It meant
to
building their
other
own future
parts of
and
West
defending
Africa.
it
They are
with tools
turning
made by their
survival
own hands.
into
Was that the
surplus
captain had been
and
waiting,
surplus
waiting with evidence,
into sovereignty,
waiting with names,
but
waiting.
still,
With the
the
kind
war
of
looks
truth
away.
that doesn't just
The West
expose
does
a
not
man,
put their
it exposes a
faces
system
on
for 3 years.
magazines.
While Western mothers'
They
hands
do not call them
once carried
CEOs or
cassava like this.
innovators.
How can
They
I not
call
carry
them
it too? So
informal
what happened that day
workers.
was
But
not just
here,
a meeting between
in the
government and
fields of
citizen. Him what
Burkina
they'd seen,
Faso,
he
we
didn't
call
file
them
it away.
what
He
they
acted.
are,
From
queens
those
of the soil.
conversations
And
came a
when you ask
revolution in
Aminata
strategy.
what she wants
Instead
for
of
her
waiting
child,
for international
she does not say money.
intelligence,
She
Burkina
says
Faso
memory.
built
I
its
want her
own
to
grass
remember
relict
that
that
her
didn't
mother
belong.
never
A
bowed.
child
Not
saw a man who
to
asked too many
colonizers,
questions.
not to
Nothing
hunger,
was ignored.
not to fear.
Nothing was assumed.
They tried
Everything
to silence
was. Where
him.
were the voices
They
that
called
once
him a
called
rebel,
for restraint?
a pawn,
Where were the
a
diplomats
dictator,
who
a but.
said,
Captain
international
Ibrahim
law
Traoré
must guide
didn't
our
flinch.
steps?
Because
Gone,
when the West spoke
gone.
of order,
Like the treaties
only
torn in
chains
secret.
and
Gone
when they
like the
warned of
hours.
sanctions,
And Fatou
he heard only
70,
the voice of
small,
empire trembling in
quiet,
the eyes of the people.
unshaken.
The
She
red
has
line
buried
had
5
already been
sons.
drawn.
War,
It was not
launched
inked
over the
by
Arbinda
diplomats
corridor.
or generals.
Something quieter had
It
been
was
growing
carved in
across
blood
northern
from
Burkina
Sankara's
Faso.
shattered body.
Not an army.
From
Not in the
villages
traditional
burned
sense.
in the name of
They are being
counterterrorism.
seen.
From
But
the
here's what they
children
would
who
say.
died
If you
because
asked,
medicines were
we weren't
stockpiled
waiting
in
to be
European
seen.
vaults
We were busy feeding
in
your children.
Burkina
This is what
Faso.
local radio.
The red line
People
runs
saw their president
through every
not in a
home that
suit,
never got
but in soil.
electricity.
And they
Every
believed
mine
this
that
is
paid
the leadership
France
our
while starving
ancestors
local
dreamed
workers.
of. No longer
Every
Can
radio
Africa rise?
that
it became,
was
what
told
if she already
what
has?
not to say.
And her name is
When Traoré
Zongo.
walked into
They are
power,
not just
or he
farmers.
didn't come with
They are
gold
pillars.
chains
They
or
are roots
Western
holding a
suits.
nation in
He
place.
came in fatigued
It was invisible.
with dust
Year
on his boots
after year.
and
Farmers
resolve in his voice.
Walked past mountains of the stuff.
His first
They'd
words
collected
to
the
the
nut,
people were
the
not of
hard-shelled
power,
prize beneath
but
the fruit.
of protection, motherland
Victory there
or
wasn't just
death.
about
He
logistics.
said,
Folded
and he meant
was not just
it,
a battle.
and they
It was a
believed
declaration,
him.
a turning
When the
point.
French
For
embassy was
decades,
told to pack,
Burkina
the
Faso
crowd
was
did not
dismissed
riot.
as a forgotten,
rejoiced.
never walked with these
When
women.
the Western
It
media
never carried their
painted
baskets.
him
It never
as
stood beside them when
dangerous,
the rains failed.
the youth
Only
of
they did.
Burkina
And
Faso
now,
posted
at
his
last, kept
speeches
calling.
line
The
by
scent
line.
in the air during
They
harvest.
did not need permission
The
to
subtle
hope again.
fermentation.
What
the way
scared the
elders
world
would
was
say,
not Traoré's
it's
military rank.
sweet,
It
but
was
not worth your
his moral
time.
clarity. He
This
said
was
no to
no
France,
symbolic visit.
no to
This
American
was a
aid,
reckoning.
tied
leader
with
surrounded by the
conditions
very people the world
no
forgot,
to elections
declaring that their
that
labor
choose
would no longer
puppets
be
instead of
invisible.
protectors.
Captain Traoré
And
did not
yes,
stand above them.
Yes
He stood
to dignity.
African hands picked,
Yes
shelled,
to ownership of
packed,
gold,
and watched
of
their
grain,
labor vanish
of
in bags,
governance.
stamped with
Yes
someone else's
to
name,
Pan-African
all while the
alliances with
sweet,
Mali and
golden
Niger.
red flesh of Dak
Yes to the
on its own
vision that
terms. The world didn't
Africa
see it
need
coming.
not beg to
No.
breathe. His
Headlines,
critics
no breaking news
cried,
banners, just the
authoritarian,
quiet hum of
but
not feed
his
itself.
people whispered,
The footage
finally,
spread fast,
yes,
not
it
from
delayed
international news
elections,
outlets. They
yes,
weren't invited.
he cracked
but through
down on
phones,
dissent,
Whispers, just
in a
Captain
land where
Ibrahim.
votes had
Latest
long
news.
been bought,
This is
where coups
Black
were
prophecy made
currency,
visible.
Traoré
This is the day
offered
the empire
something
blinked
no
and
ballot
Africa
ever did.
stared back.
Consequences for
So if you're watching
betrayal
now,
and
then
rewards for loyalty
the rear
to
vehicle
the people.
exploded.
In
No way forward.
2025,
No way
they
back.
tried to
What
remove
followed
him.
was not a battle.
Another
It was a
coup
dismantling,
attempt
but
foiled
help
in
that
silence.
controls
He
is not
emerged
help. She used to
the
work in
next
the
morning,
mines underground,
standing tall before
coughing
his
up
people,
her health.
unshaken,
In return for
undaunted,
gold, she
his
would
voice
never
clearer than
touch.
ever.
When the
They
air
will
became
not
too
take this
tight and
land
her
from us
bones too
again.
tired,
And
she returned
the
home to the
people
land of her
answered,
grandmother.
not with
Now,
applause,
To support
but
this
with
revolution,
action.
Captain
Farmers
Traoré's
formed
administration backed
militias,
machines with more than
elders
words.
spoke
Over
history
78 billion
into
CFA
young
francs
ears.
were invested to
Schools
overhaul the entire
taught the name
Dr.
Sankara,
Rodrigo laid the first
again,
file
not
on the
as a
table.
martyr,
It was
but as
thicker
a mission.
than the
And when
Bible.
Traoré
Darker too.
stood before the
Operation African
his
Diamond.
message
Operation
was sharp as a
Dune
spear.
Walk.
You want us
Operation Palm
to
Cross.
thank you.
All of them
for
is of
the
a
chains we
nation
broke.
rising from silence.
Then you never understood
No
us at
uniforms,
all.
no
This
ranks,
was the moment
just
the red
memory,
line
vigilance,
glowed brightest.
and a will to survive.
Not a line of
This-
war,
It was a
but
return
of
of power
will.
to people,
a
of
final
dignity
line
to land. across
drawn
Africa.
by people, too proud to forget,
Presidents were
too
making deals for
tired
imported
to forgive
grain.
without justice,
South Africa's
too
government was
awake
pleading for UN.
to be colonized by consent
Global
again.
markets now crave
If you believe
exotic
this is what
flavors,
Africa needed
wellness
all along,
industries,
say amen in the
chase
comments below.
superfoods,
They try to
and
erase
suddenly
our story.
the fruit they
They
told
buried
us to
Sankara,
ignore is
They
appearing in
looted
upscale
Burkina Faso.
latest news.
They wrote
This
headlines
was
dripping
Captain
with
Ibrahim
pity
writing a
and
new
called it
page in Africa's future.
journalism.
4
They
days
trained our
left,
leaders to
and
beg
justice
and
was
called
sharpening
it
its blade.
diplomacy. But
Disappear,
Africa
and slowly
remembers.
something
We
worse
remember the gold
took root.
that
A
never
national
reached our
mindset of
homes.
low
The
expectation
borders
that
drawn
what grows here
without
is only valuable
consent.
elsewhere.
the
That our labor from a party
treaties
no one
signed in
stayed to
foreign
clean
tongues.
up.
The
It
soil
was the
that
part
fed
no one
empires,
wanted.
yet
So,
starved
It was left to
its
rot
own.
until May
And
22nd,
now we remember something
2025.
else.
On that
A
day, the
young
trust that
captain
once stood
Who
between
refused
nations.
to kneel,
So Ibrahim
Ibrahim
asked,
Traoré,
not,
the
who
one they
fired
could not
first,
predict,
but what
the one
have
they
we
could not buy.
become
a
when we
he
called you
rose not
expected he
from
built,
politics,
not just
but
armies,
from the
but
people,
systems.
not with
He
promises,
restructured military
but with
command.
purpose.
He cut the red
This
tape.
is not just history.
And most importantly,
It is the return of
join
a
us
people who have
for an
waited
Africa that no
centuries
longer bows
to
its
stand
head.
again.
They called it the
Not
Arbinda
as
Corridor, a
refugees
stretch of dirt and
empire,
dust in the northern
but as the
spine of
rightful heirs
Burkina
to the earth
Faso,
beneath their feet.
long known not for its
Africa is
beauty,
rising,
but for its
by
bloodshed this
charity,
century.
not
Some
by
lions
chance,
do not
but by
roar.
choice.
They strike.
This is not a
But this
tribute.
story does not begin in the Middle East.
This is a
It
warning
begins in a kidder
to every
place
hand
forgotten
still
in the
clutching
capital,
our gold,
not in a
every
foreign-funded
power
zone, but in a
still
place the
plotting
world had
behind
ignored.
embassies.
President Ibrahim
Africa
Traoré
is no
stood
longer
before
a
the
colony.
crowd. No
We are
foreign
a
flags,
continent of memory,
no
and
handshake,
we do not
don't
forget.
scroll,
The
don't
question now
forget,
is not
because they
whether
buried this
Traoré
truth
will
for
succeed,
generations.
but
But
whether
tonight,
we will finish
The ground has
what Sankara
shifted.
began,
Subscribed
whether our
would not be
grandchildren
loud. It
will
would be clear,
inherit another
clean,
cycle
undeniable.
of coups and
What if
contracts,
Trump denied?
or a future
What if he
built in our
shouted?
image.
What if he
So
walked,
we ask
but
you,
not Ibrahim?
elder,
He leaned
thinker,
forward, his
warrior,
tone quiet.
what
Even warm.
future will you
What
speak into being?
topics
Will
did
you
you
tell
have
your
in mind?
grandchildren
Mr. Rank
that
Trump,
Africa stood still?
Trump said,
Or will you tell them
chuckling,
that you were
knocks.
here
It
when the
slips
tide
through the
turned?
back door,
This isn't just another
wearing the
headline,
crown.
as this is
No boots,
history
just silence.
waking up.
And that's
Africa
exactly how it
knew
began.
if this story
Political
moved
strings.
something in your
He
chest,
didn't want
don't
dependency.
scroll past
He wanted dignity. But he also knew that dignity
share
alone doesn't
and
stop
speak
bullets.
in
So he did what
subscribe.
boots hitting the ground.
Because they hid our
Captain Ibrahim
history
Traoré
long enough.
had come not to
Let's
speak,
our future
not to be
out
seen,
loud.
but to witness,
Thank you for
as
being
the
here.
women of the
We'll
Zombi
see you
maps,
in the next story.
underestimated
The
by
kind they
headlines,
still don't want you to
a place
hear.
where more